Now, for our final speaker of the day, we also have somebody who challenges established perspectives. Rory Sutherland's early career was as a creative and copywriter for Ogilvy. Becoming vice chairman afforded him the luxury to set up a behavioural science practice within the agency that seeks out the unseen opportunities. He's also authored a number of books, the most recent with a former colleague Pete Dyson, entitled Transport for Humans. So it gives me great pleasure this afternoon to welcome our final speaker, Rory Sutherland. Rory.
First of all, just to say how marvellous that prior speaker was, and how doubly marvellous that they mentioned one of my favourite books, which is The Silo Effect by Gillian Tett, which shows the very, very interesting effect when an anthropologist effectively looks at business through an anthropological lens, which is a completely fresh perspective. It's one of the reasons she's one of the very few people to predict the financial crisis, for example, in that she noticed peculiar tribal blindness emerging among people in particular categories of the financial industry. And I think there's a wider question there, which is what tends to happen is we really live in a complex world, and you have to acknowledge complexity, okay? Not just complicatedness, but complexity in any field in which human perception and psychology is involved, okay? We don't like that very much because the problem-solving tools we've mastered perhaps as engineers or in GCSE maths are gloriously, albeit falsely, unambiguous. There's a single right answer. Anything that isn't the single right answer is wrong, okay? All the data you require to arrive at that answer is available to you. There is no superfluous data that you need to decide to ignore. And when you look at it, actually, GCSE maths questions are, I think, a very bad influence on our problem-solving abilities because they're a completely artificial construct. As I said in the book with Pete Dyson, a GCSE maths question typically says 2 buses leave a point at noon, one travels north at a speed of 40 kilometres an hour, the other one travels due west at a speed of 30 kilometres an hour. What time is it when they're 100 kilometres apart? Well, the first point you might make is it's very rare in real life that you really need to know that kind of shit, to be absolutely honest, because I very rarely sat in a bus and wondered how far away another bus might be. But secondly, it's, when you think about it, a complete nonsense, because you have it assumes that buses travel in a straight line at a constant speed. It's absolutely riven with assumptions in order to give the illusion of effectively a single answer. And if you're being really tough, you could say that science is a bit of a con, because it defines those few areas of life where you can be definitively right as being science, and refuses to engage with areas of life where you don't have that same sense of, in a sense, what you might call confected certainty. If you want to get the real intellectual lowdown on this, there's a whole paper by Hayek when he accepts his Nobel Prize, which is called The Illusion of Knowledge, and attacks a thing called scientism, which is the application of scientific methods to fields altogether different to those in which they've been developed. Okay? And one of the things you notice is that what tends to happen when people aren't comfortable with systems thinking, when they're comfortable within a silo, is you have a thing which is often called quantification bias. In the Vietnam War, it was called the McNamara effect. It's where you basically say everything we can manage and put onto a spreadsheet is duly deemed to be important, and everything that doesn't fit on a spreadsheet doesn't count. Now, what tends to happen over time when you do that is that the things that are outside your model, the things you've chosen to ignore for the purposes of arriving at, the artificial single right answer, or what John Maynard Keynes called, we'd often rather be precisely wrong than vaguely right, okay, is that the things you ignore come back to bite you. And what tends to happen over a period of time is you over-optimize those things which you can mathematically optimize or measure, at the expense of things which are quite often softer measures. And practically all of psychology actually defies, so far, numerical measurement. We have an SI unit for time and speed and distance and mass and gravity and so forth, but we don't have a psychological measure for regret, okay? I did propose one once. It was called the BEST, named after Pete Best, and it's the degree of regret you experience in nearly being in the Beatles, okay? And so if you narrowly missed a train, you might experience a pico best or a milli best. But so far my plans to create SI units for emotions haven't gone very far. There are some interesting findings, by the way. It's much more irritating to narrowly miss a train than it is to miss a train by 20 minutes. And this is one of the problems of mathematical models. Mathematical models assume everything is aggregatable. They assume that relationships are linear. They assume, quite often, trade-offs. And a trade-off is creatively limiting because it automatically puts you in the position where you can only have one thing or another, okay? And it tends to assume ergodicity, which, apart from a few physicists in the room, don't worry, I won't expect you to know, and I won't explain it because it takes too long to explain. But let's put it another way, okay? High-speed 1 is a great idea. It's been a huge success. Very sensibly, they ran it alongside the A2. Very sensibly, because if you're already living next to a sodding great road, you really can't complain that much about having a railway, okay? If I'm right, now there might be people in the room who know, Ove Arup proposed doing the same thing for high-speed 2, okay? Which is run it along the M40. There's no reason, by the way, why you couldn't have paid for high-speed 2 through land value capture. You simply create a few artificial stations between London and Oxford, buy 10,000 acres of agricultural land, yourself as the government award yourself planning permission around these stations, and you've made about £15 billion a pop just by doing that. But unfortunately, the people who think about land value and planning permission don't talk to the people who think about transport. And this is where this silo question comes up. I'm not making this up, by the way, and it's a story I only half like telling, which is in 2018, actually it might have been 2019, but before the pandemic, in August, I had a meeting with the marketing director of Zoom. And a couple of things happened. I said, hypothetically, you offer contracts to Zoom for companies, and therefore every employee in the company for a certain monthly payment can use your technology. Have you ever thought of doing it with a country? What would you charge? Now, I thought it was a bit of a wacko suggestion, but interestingly, she got back to me and said, actually, the people in California are really interested in this idea. What if the UK government paid us 50 million quid a month and everybody in Britain could use Zoom? Okay? And I thought, well, this is quite interesting. I didn't expect this response. Shall I take it to the Department for Transport? And then I realized that the Department for Transport is actually called the Department for Transport. It's not called the Department for Stopping People Moving About so fucking much, right? Now, interestingly, in Finland, as my colleague Pete Dyson, who knows more about this stuff than I do, my co-author Pete Dyson, in Finland they actually have a Ministry of Transport and Connectivity. So maybe the place I should have taken that to was the Finnish government. And I then had interesting discussions about why is it, bear in mind this was pre-pandemic, why is it that video conferencing uptake is so dismally small? And it really came down to psychological factors. All the logical arguments were there actually 12 years ago. The technology was mostly there 10 to 12 years ago. But it was really the idea that, as I said, if you suggested a physical meeting, that was Coke. If you suggested a teleconference, it was Dr. Pepper, right? Now, the point I make about that is, if you ask for a Coke in a pub, none of your friends ever pass comment. You can ask for a Coke anywhere in the world, from a kind of Tanzanian beach shack to a Michelin-starred restaurant, and the request for a glass of Coke, if they haven't got it, it's their fault, not yours. There's a particular nature to that kind of request, which is it will be weird to refuse it. If you ask for a Dr. Pepper, all your friends go, "Ew," and the waiter goes, "Monsieur, we do not stock it, you imbecile," okay? Fundamentally, asking for a video conference just felt more awkward than suggesting a physical meeting. It also seemed like it wasn't a great way of signaling that you cared, okay? So my suggestion at the time was, why don't you create a big campaign saying, basically thank Zoom, it's Friday, and encourage people to video conference on Friday, which is already informally a kind of working from home day, and then see if you can instill it in one day of the week and grow from there. And just as she was leaving, I said, of course, what you really need, if you want to get video conferencing off the ground, is a major transport strike or a minor pandemic. And every time I think back on my words, a little bit of sick comes up in my mouth. Did I really say that? So anyway, we've put her in touch with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and no. But the point I'm making about this systems thinking question is that, to some extent, the widespread adoption of video conferencing has gifted the UK with a world-class rail and road network without actually any money being spent on significant infrastructure, simply through the mechanism of creating more half-terms, more times when there are fewer people moving about and when there's less concentration of travel, because it's actually the concentration of behaviour. This is what I'm saying, is that actually for every component to which there might be an infrastructure problem, there may also, the infrastructure solution, there may also be a psychological or behavioural solution. And we should look at them in the round. If you recognise me at all, it's probably from a TED talk I gave in about 2009 or something, where I simply made the point, if you have a 6 billion budget to improve the Eurostar between London and Paris, yes, okay, 6 billion gets you high-speed railway tracks from St Pancras down to the coast. But are there other ways in which you could make Eurostar more desirable than flying? Because that's really your competition. And I merely said, half-jokingly, well, you could put Wi-Fi on the trains, which they didn't do, for weirdly, for 12 years after they had spent £6 billion increasing the speed of the journey. Okay? Because what you're doing there is not numerically quantifiable. It doesn't fit in the pre-existing model because it's not changing the quantity of time, it's changing the quality of time. And we have measures for quantity, but we don't have measures for quality. Okay? And then, as a kind of slightly flippant thing, I said, if you really want to spend £1 billion of your budget, okay, you can employ all of the world's top male and female supermodels, get them to walk up and down the train handing out free Chateau Petrus to all the passengers. You'll have saved yourself £5 billion, and people will ask for the trains to be slowed down. Funnily enough, I then made that joke with an audience that contained the former marketeer of Eurostar, and I expected to be beaten up. And he said, I kind of agreed with you. Strangely, among our leisure passengers, when we made the trains faster, a significant number of the leisure passengers complained because they really enjoyed the journey. Nobody boasts about how fast a cruise ship is, because it's an assumption of a cruise ship that the time spent on board is actually enjoyable. There's an utterly absurd thing now where, in order to increase the capacity of trains, I'm not making this up also, and also because the claim is that if you have tables on trains, okay, it reduces the ingress and egress time at each station. So more and more trains don't have tables on board, which renders the 1 hour on the train completely unproductive. What is the single great virtue of a train over any other form of transport other than, I guess, sort of BA first class or the back of a 1970s Rolls Royce? It's you get a table, okay? Now, I know people who work in rail prefer to talk about, signalling and junction boxes and the system. But experientially, looked at from the consumer's point of view, actually, the USP of the train is you can have a cup of coffee, a laptop, a bit of shit, generally, a sandwich, okay? And you can travel face to face. What do? They make everybody face the same way like a sodding bus, and they take the tables away, okay? Now, that is to a minute degree reducing wasted time on the rail network. It's to a massive degree reducing the quality of time spent on a train. And that's what I mean about how metrics are dangerous. The guy who said, what gets measured gets managed, did not intend it as an exhortation, he meant it as a criticism. Okay? The full quote goes, what gets measured gets managed, even when it is pointless to measure and manage it, and may actively harm the organization to do so. Okay? It's not an encouragement, an exhortation, it's a warning, effectively. And if you get obsessed with this quantification bias, okay, you become a bit dumb. Now, one thing marketers do, I would say that marketing and innovation are fundamentally the same thing. Now, this evening, you're going to see a great magician and behavioral science expert if you're staying on for the dinner as your after-dinner speaker. He's called Paul Craven. He was formerly a managing director at Goldman Sachs, where, of course, he performed the fantastic trick of making half the economy disappear. Okay, But he will be, and he actually boarded the train 2 minutes, same train as me, 2 minutes before it left. And I thought, you don't leave much of a margin of error, do you? I thought, kind of figures, doesn't it? Anyway, okay. But he's a wonderful man, fantastic exponent of behavioral science. And what magic and behavioral science kind of have in common is that what we pay attention to affects what we perceive, how we respond, the emotions that are generated, and it affects how we behave. Okay, so the reason I say that marketing and innovation are fundamentally the same thing, or they're two sides of the same coin, is there are two ways you can innovate. You can either find out what people want and work out a really clever way to make it, or you can work out what you can make and find a really clever way to make people want it. And the money you make and the consequent value you generate for the economy is indistinguishable regardless of your direction of travel between those two modes. If that sounds implausible, okay? Imagine you were setting out to make a drink to compete with Coca-Cola 20 years ago. You'd sit down in a room and you go, well, we need a drink that tastes nicer than Coke, costs less than Coke, and comes in a really big can so people get great value for money, okay? All perfectly logical, okay? Now, this is a problem, I think, in an engineering culture. It's much, much easier to get fired for being illogical than it is for being unimaginative, okay? There's a fundamental asymmetry when we work within organizations, okay, that causes us to prefer the incremental and the definite to the miraculous and the probabilistic. We'd rather have a definite 2% than a 50% chance of 20% in many cases. You know, I think the shareholder value movement, I think quarterly reporting, I think a whole load of business cultures have developed in the last 20 years which have basically promulgated a kind of small-mindedness in business decision-making. Which is, and of course, what's the safest thing of all? Cost cutting. But it's much, much easier to measure a cost than it is to measure an opportunity cost. So we end up with this kind of asymmetry of perception. But the point I'm making, okay, is let's imagine, okay, you want to be logical. No one will ever get fired for that. They produce a drink that did really well in research, okay, that just kind of failed. What's the most successful attempt to compete with Coca-Cola in the last 50 years? It's Red Bull. Comes in a tiny can, costs a fortune, it tastes disgusting, right? And when they researched it, people were practically projectile vomiting. However, this is where psychology comes in. If you position the thing as a drug, not a drink, all of those things become positives, not negatives. Because how you look at something fundamentally affects what it is, okay? Okay. Now, every person in engineering wants to look at objective reality. The link between objective reality and consumer perception is completely fuzzy because our whole human perception has been evolved to optimize survival, not to optimize accuracy. Okay? Everything about how we perceive and feel and decide has been determined by evolution as a survival mechanism, as a survival improving, fitness improving device, not as an accuracy improving device. Okay, we know this from language. Time flies when you're having fun. It was the longest 10 minutes of my life. Do you want an even simpler example? There's a beautiful thing in our book featured, and I can't remember what it's called. It's called something like the kinetometer, developed by an Italian designer. And it's a speedometer which shows it the other way around, right? It says minutes per 10 miles, not miles per hour. Now, a few of you might have noticed this when you first got a sat-nav. Which is when I got a sat-nav, I basically stopped driving like a dick. Because over time, what I realized is the difference between 30 miles an hour and 40 miles an hour makes quite a big difference to your arrival time. The difference between 65 miles an hour and 70 miles an hour, or 70 miles an hour and 75 miles an hour, basically shaves a couple of minutes off your trip, off your trip. Now, we don't think that because our brains kind of look at numbers and go, well, the difference between 20 and 30 is the same as the difference between 70 and 80, okay? Actually, going 90 miles an hour is a complete mug's game because it hardly saves you any time at all, and then you get stuck at the same traffic lights as everybody else, okay? What's so fascinating about that is that, okay, 10 minutes for 10 miles and 60 miles an hour are exactly the same speed. If cars had been equipped with these speedometers the other way around, every single person's pattern of driving would have been different over the 100 years of the existence of the automobile. even though the information is scientifically identical in SI unit terms, simply presenting it the other way would completely change the way we behave. Okay? Now, I find that really interesting. Now, in the same way, okay, if you make Red Bull into a drug, a psychoactive substance, rather than a drink, the things that were good become bad. Everything is like that, and it is insane to try and solve engineering problems without making some acknowledgement to the vagaries of perception. That's what I'm saying. So here we go. This is what happens, okay, when you're given the brief for High Speed 2, but you look at it through the lens of passenger perception, not through the lens of network optimization. Most people look at trains through the efficient operation of a network, and as a result, what happens is the perceptual, subjective component of the journey becomes overlooked. Now, the first question you might ask is the assumption of ergodicity or commutability, okay? Now, High Speed 1, wonderful thing, okay, means that if you live in Canterbury and you decide to commute to London, the same person saves about, I'd say, 200 hours a year, okay? So that's one person saving 200 hours a year because it's a commuter railway. If you build High Speed 2, there aren't going to be that many people daily commuting between London and Manchester, so it's more like 200 people saving 1 hour a year, right? Okay? Maybe it's 20 people saving 10 hours a year. Now, to a mathematical model which doesn't distinguish between people and which assumes kind of commutability and assumes ergodicity, okay, that is an equally valuable saving in time. To a human, it isn't, because the Canterbury 200 hours a year that's suddenly added to the commuter's life is actually completely life-changing, okay? Whereas for 10 people to save 20 hours a year, that's merely a convenience. And for, 100 people to save 1 hour a year is barely noticeable. That overall plan to route High Speed 2 along the M40 corridor was apparently rejected because it took 4 minutes longer, and the 4 minutes were calculated at being worth X billion pounds, which ruled that idea out. No one who's had any experience of human beings can seriously have used 4 minutes as an argument. Do you really think people go, I would go to Manchester today, but it takes 4 minutes too long? It is total bollocks, by the way. Let's talk in defence of a few railway companies. It's total bollocks that they're fined when they arrive 3 minutes late to a London terminus. One, because the alternative is going by car, in which case your arrival time is completely in the lap of the gods, right? And secondly, because unless you're Swiss or anally retentive, or work for Goldman Sachs, most people build a small buffer into their arrival time so they don't assume that the whole journey is going to go perfectly. Absolutely ridiculous, okay? It's the use of statistics in aggregate, which when divided to the extent of individual human beings, are utterly meaningless in terms of experience or behavior. So, okay, here's the human-centered solution to High Speed 2. What do you want to do? Increase capacity? Right, reduce journey time. Right, okay, first of all, get rid of your silo, define journey time end to end. Okay? Secondly, look at the parts of the journey where quality of time is worse, because that's the time you want to really reduce. Okay? Right? Thirdly, actually, if you look at capacity, okay, there is a way you can solve this, and it's basically seat frog, okay? When I go to Manchester, and I do this about 6 times a year, I book an advance ticket, because otherwise it costs £1 billion, okay? And because I can't afford to miss my train, because otherwise they'll throw away my advance ticket and charge me a full fare, okay, I leave a bit of a margin of error coming from Kent. Which means that in between the time I arrive at Euston and board my designated train, 2 trains, 20 and 40 minutes before my own, okay, leave for Manchester, which I'm not allowed to board. They're typically half empty. What you do is you create a simple system, a simple app, which says, I'm at Euston. It says the train that's leaving in 5 minutes' time is actually free. You can have seat H7 for a £5. I've reduced my journey time by 40 minutes. So sorry, I thought I'd turn this bloody thing off. and they've made some money, right? What you've also done is you've increased capacity. Now, normally I have to explain this, okay? I'm assuming in a bunch of transport people, you're good enough systems thinkers to recognize that if you allow people to board a train earlier where there is vacant seating, you are actually increasing the capacity of the network, okay? Weird thing, by the way, it's completely obvious with cars and helicopters, right? That if you have a bunch of people queuing to get somewhere, okay, and a car comes in, a taxi comes in to take someone from a church to a wedding reception, you'd obviously make sure every car left full, wouldn't you, right? Because that's how you increase the efficient use of the car. Weirdly, with trains, that isn't intuitively obvious. It's obvious with helicopters, right? Okay, when you're evacuating the US Embassy compound in Saigon, what they did is they made sure that every helicopter left with as many people on it as were available to board. They didn't say, no, this one's going to leave half empty because you're booked on the 12:30. That would have really pissed people off, okay? Now, all I'm saying, I'm not saying you shouldn't build high speed too. I'm just saying that since there's an app solution, now the third thing you're doing there is the time on the train is high quality time. I can work, I've got a table, someone brings me a cup of tea, right? We had a nice chat. I really, really like being on the train. The time that's a pain in the arse is standing around Euston Station feeling like a dick, right? So what you've done is you've reduced the worst duration part of the journey. You've enabled me to board an earlier train, which means I get to Manchester 40 minutes earlier, and you've increased the efficient use of the network. Some clue that actually pricing and nudging may be a solution to the capacity of that network is given by the fact that, is given by the fact that the most crowded trains on that network by far are the first off-peak train of the day, okay? So it's clear that actually shifting behavior could massively increase capacity and reduce overcrowding. Now, what interested me about the silo effect was that when I suggested this to various people in the rail industry, they became angry because they thought it was cheating, okay? Because if you come from an engineering background, rewriting the question is cheating because you're used to having a completely objective definition of success. I come from a marketing background, okay? There isn't an objective definition of success. You can rewrite the rules any way you like, and quite often the opposite of a good idea is another good idea, okay? That's why psychology is fundamentally messy, complex, and requires creative solutions rather than objective solutions. And so this is the point I'm trying to make, which is that I think what happens over time, and it happens in lots and lots of different ways, is that a kind of need to be rational overcomes the people who operate these entities, where in a sense it's a kind of corporate autism or corporate Asperger's, okay? In other words, only those things you can quantify are considered valid. And it worries me. I'll give you a few examples, okay? It is very difficult if you work for Transport for London to get, okay, what's one of the greatest brilliant pieces of invention in transport in the last 20 years? The Uber map, okay? It doesn't change the speed at which a car turns up. It merely changes the quality of your waiting time by reducing uncertainty, okay? 5 things for which we don't have measures. David Rock, a neuroscientist, it's his SCARF model: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, fairness. Okay? Relatedness might be reciprocality, if you like. Okay? Now, what's really interesting there about the Uber map, okay, is that if you went to some software engineers and said, people, which is accurate, don't like waiting for cabs, that's true. Therefore, we will try and reduce the objective waiting time for a taxi. What you'd probably suggest is some sort of predictive algorithm which sends cabs to where they're needed, and so people don't have to wait as long. Not a totally crazy idea. It does require you to be quite a big cab company to make it work, and it would also really piss off cab drivers when you got it wrong and sent them into the middle of nowhere on a Saturday night, okay? But it's not a totally crazy idea. What Uber did, and he had the inspiration apparently watching the James Bond film Goldfinger, where those of you who remember Goldfinger will know that Bond has to pursue Goldfinger while remaining discreetly out of sight through the Swiss Alps. So obviously that calls for an Aston Martin DB4, doesn't it? But we'll park that obvious illogicality, and he simply had a tracking device and a rolling map in the dashboard of the DB4. And one of the co-founders of Uber said that's what you need when you book a cab, because it doesn't change the quantity of time, it completely changes the emotional experience of waiting by reducing the degree of uncertainty. Previously you had, oh God, where's my cab? He's probably around the corner, I don't know. Maybe they lied, maybe there isn't a cab at all. And now you go, oh look, he's stuck at those traffic lights, I'll make myself a cup of tea, okay? I think there's also a little bit of status involved in the Uber map, in that it may just be me, but I think people time their arrival on the pavement to coincide with the car drawing up, because it makes them feel like Kaiser Soze at the end of The Usual Suspects. You know, it makes you feel like Louis XIV, right? You know, walking out of a building as a car draws up, you know, it's a bit, that's what happens in Succession, isn't it? You don't get the people in Succession going, where's my fucking helicopter, right? Okay? And so it just also, I think it adds to a bit of status as well. Now, what I'm saying here is that the need to be objective and mathematical and have a single right answer comes at a cost, which is that over time you increasingly ignore any subjective factor to the point at which actually your activities become misdirected. And we see this with, you know, ironing board seats on trains, the removal of tables, all in pursuit of some particular metric or other, okay? And actually, ultimately, the question you need to ask, a true question, has a degree of subjectivity in it. What can we do in engineering, marketing, presentation terms that makes the Eurostar more desirable than the flight? You know, some of that was advertising, by the way. There's a brilliant behavioral science finding which says that people hate travelling in the wrong direction, even if it saves them time. And Eurostar put up posters on the way to Heathrow which said, Paris is east of here, why are you driving west? Okay, brilliant, okay? Change the perception of the time. Now, all I'm saying here is that I think that this is a silo problem. I think that what happens is people become more and more enmeshed in the same comparative measures. And actually, the great joy of behavioral science is this, and you'll discover a lot more from Paul Craven if you're staying for dinner and staying after dinner, okay? When you add perceptual solutions to your toolkit, the solution space gets a lot bigger. Yes, it gets a bit more ambiguous. Yes, it requires a bit more creativity. It requires a bit more boldness. But ultimately, the value of adding a psychological solution set to your engineering solution set and pairing them up is that actually your capacity to solve problems efficiently basically goes up, I would argue exponentially. Don't necessarily, and Paul as a magician, behavioral scientist and everything else will know, don't necessarily change what is, change what people see. That's it. Thank you very much indeed.